When you're doing IVF, several embryos are often created and one is typically transferred. But what happens with the other embryos made? That's what we're talking about today on Lunchtime Live with the Center. We are going behind the scenes with embryologist Shannon Farrell to talk all about embryo cryopreservation, including what it is and how it works. Shannon, hi, welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So you're welcome, and it's lovely to have you here. What is cryopreservation of embryos?
So, cryopreservation, it's a method of freezing the embryo in its current state during a fresh cycle to be used at a later date.
Okay, so and why would so can you talk a little bit about the freezing process?
Sure. So, we use a process called vitrification. It's different than what you think of when you think of freezing something, usually in a traditional, like frozen anything, ice cubes or vegetables. Um, Ice crystals are formed, and ice crystals would damage the cells of an embryo. So instead, we use this process called vitrification, and it involves dehydrating the embryo so that ice crystals don't form. And then we use this highly concentrated cryopreservation media so that when the embryo is placed in liquid nitrogen, it forms a super cooled glass like state. It's called vitrification. And so we store these embryos on these special devices. I don't know how well you can see it,
You can see it,
but
yes.
what we use is it's called a cryo lock, and we put the embryos just on the tip right here, and then this whole thing is stored in liquid nitrogen.
Oh, very cool. So are the embryos themselves stored in liquid nitrogen, or is that
Yeah, so these straws go on another sort of, we call it a cane, and they're stored in these tanks of liquid nitrogen. The liquid nitrogen itself is negative 196 degrees Celsius, so it's very, very, very cold. And we have these tanks here on site at the lab. Or if patients don't intend to use their embryos right away and it's more of a long term storage situation, they could opt to ship their embryos to a company called Reprotech, which specializes in frozen embryo storage.
so we only store for short term?
Well, we can store for long term. We've got the space here at the lab, but if a patient is done building their family for now and they want to hold on to their embryos, but they may not use them for a few years, they could send them away if they want to.
Okay. So if you have extra embryos, you would store them frozen.
Mhm.
What are some other reasons to do this, to cryopreserve your
Sure.
embryos?
Right. So, like you said, the most common reason is if you have extra embryos, you would use them for future children, or if you didn't get pregnant from your fresh cycle, you could just come back right away and use that. Another really common reason that people freeze their embryos is that a lot of people want to do pre implantation genetic testing, or PGT. And so, if you do PGT, we biopsy the embryo and send the samples away for testing, which takes some time. So, we freeze the embryo while we wait for the test results to come back. And then another common reason that people would freeze their embryos is that sometimes at the end of your IVF cycle, your hormones or your endometrial lining might not be quite where we would want it to be because of the ovarian stimulation. And so we want everything to be just perfect when we put an embryo back in. So if that is the case and everything's not perfect, your doctor might recommend that instead you freeze all of the embryos and then come back in a future cycle when we can make sure that everything is just perfect.
Okay. So can you also talk about where in the process are they frozen? Where in the IVF process, and say what day of
Sure.
development?
Yeah, so usually we almost always freeze embryos at the blastocyst stage. That's where they have the best success rates. So that's day 5, 6, or 7 of culture.
How long does it take to freeze them?
The actual process of vitrification is very efficient. It takes about 10 minutes per embryo.
Okay. And now how often when they're thawed, how often are they what is the likelihood of them surviving a thaw?
I don't know the exact number, but almost always the
Oh,
success rate is very, very high. It's
and that works
unusual to have
better.
an embryo not survive.
Okay. And that tends to work better with this vitrification process versus the other slow freeze.
Exactly. Yes. Vitrification is a much more reliable method. And then I guess I should also add that we only freeze good quality embryos in the first place
Oh,
that we
okay.
believe will survive the freezing and thawing process.
And that's determined, that's if an embryo gets to the blastocyst stage, is that considered a good quality embryo?
Not automatically. We grade the trophectoderm, which becomes the placenta, and we grade the inner cell mass, which would become the fetus. And sometimes they're very poor quality, even though they're technically a blastocyst,
Okay.
but we may not freeze that, especially if the embryo or if the patient has other better quality embryos. We want to make sure that the embryo can survive the process and then also go on to establish a pregnancy.
Okay. Um, so how safe is embryo cryopreservation on the actual embryo? Are there any risks that should be considered?
No, I mean, there's always a very minimal risk that it would not survive the freeze and thaw, but overall vitrification is proven to be very reliable and it's unlikely that they would not survive.
Okay. Is this the same process that is used in egg freezing as well?
Yes. Yep, it's
Okay.
the same thing. It's a little trickier for egg freezing because the egg is just a single cell, where embryos have multiple cells. So theoretically, if one cell of the embryo didn't survive the process, but all the other ones did, then everything would be okay. But
Okay.
the egg, it's sort of an all or nothing. But still, vitrification is used. It's a very similar process, and it's also pretty reliable.
Okay. And so these are stored in our office?
Yep.
How are they? Can you talk a little bit about how they're stored or how it
Sure.
works?
We have these big tanks. They hold hundreds of embryos. We have them in a locked room, and every single tank has its own alarm system. So if there is anything at all out of the usual for that tank, we will get an alarm even in the middle of the night, and we can come and check to make sure that everything is safe.
Okay. And how long do they last? I mean, do they have a shelf life? Is there an expiration date?
No, embryos will last forever if they are stored properly. Um, Theoretically, they could be viable for years and years. Last year, I believe the record holder is an embryo last year. There was a baby in Tennessee that was born from an embryo that was frozen for 27 years.
Oh my gosh.
So
Um, is the process like freeze drying something?
it's not quite freeze drying, although technically, to be honest, I don't know how freeze drying works. But we dehydrate the embryo. We use a special media that draws the water out of the embryo. So it's dehydrated, but it's still in liquid.
Okay.
So then when we freeze it, there's just no ice crystals inside of the embryo.
It's fascinating. That's
Yeah.
awesome. So we just have one comment that's Chelsea says that this is so fun to watch, especially since one of our little embryos is currently stored there. So that it's great. Glad we can educate and give you some ideas of how things work, especially behind the scenes because we don't the embryologists don't aren't really public facing or so that's
Right.
nice that you could come and I really appreciate it, Shannon. Thanks for sharing and showing the visual too. I always love that.
Thank you for having me. And yeah, I always enjoy getting to talk about what I do because it is kind of a secretive place, the embryology lab.
It's quiet back there, but there's a lot going on.
Yeah.
All right, well, that's it for today on Lunchtime Live with the Center. You can learn more about cryopreservation or any other aspects of fertility and fertility treatment or family building at our website at yukonfertility.com. And we will see you next time. So goodbye for now.